anything after this should be live.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as chair of the Master's Level Psychology Licensed Clinical Psychotherapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic meeting. Donna Honer-Queel, who is absent. Travis Hamrick, who is absent. Rebecca Javara.
I'm here.
Lauren Lott. Not here. Iris Pauley.
Here.
Joshua Tangaway.
Here.
Kari Wolf.
Here and muted.
I note the following BSRB staff member is also present. David Fye.
Yes, I'm here.
Leslie's not joining us, is that correct?
Leslie will be on vacation this week and next, so I'll just be handling things until she comes back.
Very good. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we're conducting this meeting remotely, publicly by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to the meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended. Therefore, we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On March 21st, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email specifically to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by calling 785-296-3207, 3240, or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we started. No one was on the line. And while I was reading that introductory information, Lauren Luck did go ahead and enter the meeting, so she's in attendance today as well.
Oh, Lauren.
Hello, sorry, multitasking, had to plug the laptop in.
No problem. The meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda. So that will take us to the approval of the agenda. Does anybody have anything that they would like to add to the agenda? Okay, very good. Did everybody get an opportunity to review the minutes from our last meeting?
Yes.
Any changes or modifications to the minutes? Seeing none, those will stand. To Executive Director's report.
And Dave, usually there's a motion to approve the minutes. You want to go ahead and take a vote on that item?
Absolutely. I would entertain a motion.
So moved. Kari speaking.
Kari, thank you. Second.
I second.
Okay, Iris, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Abe, we'll go to your executive director's report.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So I'm going to provide a few updates for different items that we've been working on here at the BSRB office. One of the first items, last year and then earlier this spring, there was some federal dollars that were made available through the Spark Committee. These were related to the pandemic and some modernization efforts after or as the pandemic is moving back into a better, more positive direction. And so funding opportunities were available, but you had to apply for some of that funding and be approved. So on behalf of the agency, I did submit a couple of requests for some of that more or less grant funding. And one of those items was for a better camera for the boardroom to be able to do hybrid meetings more effectively. Currently, when we've had some of our hybrid meetings, we've been borrowing a camera from the Office of Information Technology Services, but we put in a request for funding for that, and then also one to replace the projector in the existing boardroom to allow us to have those hybrid meetings a little more effective as well. And I received information that we were approved for both awards, a little over $2,000. And so happy to report that. I've been working with the governor's staff to make sure that we're following all the reporting requirements in terms of those federal dollars. We have put in a request for those to be purchased through Office of Information Technology Services. And so we should be receiving those soon, but just wanted to let you know that. So a little bit of savings to the agency and modernizing some of our equipment in an effective way. And that should provide flexibility for some of the advisory committees too, if those choose to have in-person meetings or have remote or hybrid, that would be helpful for them as well. So another item I wanted to make you aware of, there have been a number of legislative activities the last couple of months. Every spring, the legislative session starts in January, and usually the legislative session starts in January and goes till either the late part of April, but I've seen it go as late as mid-June in some occasions. They have a period of time to where the agency needs to submit a budget request, and that actually happens back in September of every year. And then the governor's office reviews it, makes recommendations, and then during the session, both the House and the Senate review it separately. And also committees consider bills. And so this year we've had budget hearings, we've had hearings involving a bill that was requested on behalf of the agency. And then there have also been a few bills that had a connection to the BSRB or the professions that we regulate. And so first, in terms of the agency's budget, we did submit a revised budget estimate for this year, and then also a budget request for the next 2 years. Based on the fact that we are a small agency, we contract with a number of different entities for certain services. We have memorandums of understanding with some other agencies in the state to provide certain services to us. And so we did submit a revised budget estimate for this current year and then 2 more fiscal years. The governor made a recommendation to essentially have our expenditures this current year at the same amount that was approved last year. And then we had some increases in the next 2 years based on potential increase in more or less inflationary cost for some of those services we contract for. We were approved at the amounts the governor had recommended in the House. We were also approved by the amounts that the governor had recommended in the Senate. However, when we were going through that process, the House, the budget was heard in the House Higher Education Budget Committee, and they included a proviso when they heard the budget for the BSRB. And the language in that proviso basically would say, so proviso language, essentially, if it's attached to a budget, it would go into the appropriations bill, and it would either say the agency has to do something, or it would say the agency cannot do something. And the way they control that in the budget bill is to say, you're not allowed to expend funding to do X, Y, Z. And so the language they added as a proviso was it would prohibit the BSRB from adopting or imposing as a condition of obtaining or renewing licenses or permits any incentives or requirements that applicants for licensure permit or permit undergo, demonstrate familiarity with, or support any training, education, or instruction program that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, critical race theory, or other related topics. And it was noted in that language that the language does not apply to equal opportunity or equal employment opportunity materials designed to inform individuals about the prohibition on discrimination based on protected class under state and federal law. And so that was added by the House Budget Committee. when the bill was reported out from the Budget Committee to the full House Appropriations Committee, they had a discussion on whether that should stay on the budget or should be removed. Their consensus after they took a vote to remove it was that it should stay on. And so it did stay on through the House as a House position and was included in their appropriations bill. The Senate did not add similar language when the budget was heard on the Senate side. But ultimately what happens usually is the House passes a budget bill, the Senate passes a budget bill, and then they come together as a conference committee to resolve items of difference. And so that occurred last week. I believe that was finalized, and they had a consensus appropriations bill, which they ran across both floors. The consensus position in the final budget bill was to include that language for the BSRB for fiscal year 24 and 25. So that does stay on the language in the appropriations bill for the BSRB. And I think the practical effect of that would be that the BSRB really wouldn't be able to revisit the topic of adding continuing education for cultural diversity or similar topics, at least for the next 2 years. If you're wondering how this came about, the BSRB currently does not require this type of continuing education or other training, but in the bill that was requested by the BSRB based on recommendations by the board, there was a recommendation by the board and there was statutory language that was brought forward, which if it was adopted by the legislature would have decreased the number of continuing education hours for individuals who can practice at the independent level and diagnose and treat. It would have decreased those hours each license period from 6 continuing education hours down to 3. And it would have added a new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity training as a continuing education requirement for all licensees. Now, the budget bill is separate from policy bills, but they asked me questions about the policy bill in committee, and they chose to take the action in the budget committee to add that proviso, and it did stay on at the end. Now, separately, there were other actions on the BSRB bill, but I want to make you aware of that item in terms of, some of the discussions the advisory committee has had about continuing education, the topic of cultural diversity, the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion last year. And so I just want to make you aware of that item. But other than that, the amounts for the budget for the agency were approved at the same amount the governor recommended. And so the budget has been approved for the BSRB for this year and the next 2 years. And basically what happens is the legislature does not give us any money to operate. We operate based on the fees that we receive. And what the legislature does is it establishes a limit and we don't spend above that limit. So even if we have money in our main account, we would not be able to spend if we came to the limit. And so basically the legislature establishes a limit. We do our best to spend below that limit. And so those amounts have been now set for the next 2 years. And if we have ways of having savings within those next 2 years, we will do that. But I did want to make you aware of that sort of unusual proviso in the bill and see if you had any questions about that item.
Any questions?
Then I'll go ahead and provide another legislative update. So I mentioned the BSRB had requested a bill. That bill was introduced in both the House Health and Human Services Committee and also in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. On the House side, it was House Bill 2340, and on the Senate side, it was Senate Bill 176, but the language was identical. So because it was an identical bill, the position by the Senate committee was that instead of having dual bills running at the same time, they informed me that they would like to see how the House handles that bill first, and then if they pass it, it would come over to the Senate side, and so that's what occurred. So Senate Bill 176 was not heard or worked on the Senate side, but a House Bill 2340 was, and so the House heard that bill. The board worked very hard last year, and all of you as advisory committee members are well aware of that because a lot of your conversations and recommendations that were forwarded to the board were part of the ultimate bill the board put forward, and that bill was about 65 pages long. And part of that is because, overseeing 7 different professions, there's going to be different sets of statutes for some of the same changes. But in my somewhat biased opinion, I thought it was a very, very good bill. I thought it had a lot of positive changes. And the legislature really had come forward last year and had really asked agencies like the BSRB to help or try to address items like workforce issues, and especially in terms of the mental health profession. And so I think a lot of the items that the board included in that bill were really helpful for that. Some of the items that were included in that bill included reducing the number of years that some individuals would need to have practiced in other jurisdictions for reciprocity. It included development of new licenses that had really been worked through, such as some candidacy licenses for the social work profession based on what was modeled in Minnesota. There was a student addiction counselor license that's included in the bill that would allow individuals who are on track to become addiction counselors but are still working on coursework to be able to be working under that new student type of license. There was some language in the bill that would allow people who are currently licensed who have an unusual extreme situation that prevented them from completing their continuing education hours to be able to have more time to complete those hours but still renew their license if they were approved. There was some language that allowed people who were previously licensed but let their licenses lapse for one reason or another. The language would allow them to re-enter the professions easier at a lower cost. And so some really positive items in there. When the House committee worked the bill, they did make a few different changes. They removed a few different items from the bill. One, as I mentioned previously, that the board had recommended 3 hours in cultural diversity continuing education, and also reducing from 6 to 3 the hours of diagnosis and treatment for continuing education. The House committee did go ahead and remove the new language, which would have required the cultural diversity training, so that was removed from the bill. The House committee, however, did say that they wanted to reduce the number of hours of continuing education and cultural and diagnosis and treatment. They wanted to reduce that from the 6 to 3. So they wanted to decrease that down to the 3 hours, but not add any other requirement in place of the 3 hours that were going away. And this is all in the total number of hours that individuals would have to have. There was also language by the board which would have added a board member for the behavior analyst profession. That profession was added under the board's jurisdiction, I believe, back in 2014. And since that time, it has been growing. But in the statutes, it identifies which individuals would serve on the board for different professions or as public members. And there is no language about having someone from the behavior analyst profession on the board. And so the language would have added essentially a 13th board member for the behavior analyst profession. But that language was removed, and so that's not in the version of the bill. And so basically when they worked those items, they removed a few items from the bill, and then they added some different items to the bill. The items that they added, one of those items would have made changes to the requirements to become a clinical social worker. Right now, there is a certain amount of education that individuals have to receive to do diagnosis and treatment. And there are specific classes that are identified in the statute. It also talks about having 3,000 hours of postgraduate experience, including 1,500 hours diagnosing and treating. And there were some changes that were made by that House committee that would remove most of that required education, dropping it from about 15 hours down to about 3 hours, and cross out most of those required classes. And then language was also added in terms of the 1,500 hours diagnosing and treating, so that it would say of the 1,500 hours, it would include but be not limited to diagnosing and treating, which would open that up and allow a lot of other things to qualify for that. But from a licensing perspective, it would establish a new standard of us not being able to require 1,500 hours in that. And so as long as there was some hours diagnosing and treating, that appears that it would be sufficient to satisfy that new standard. And so we brought these changes to the board with concern. And then there were a couple other changes they made as well. One of the changes they made was to add language that would require the agency within the 15 days of an application to essentially have reviewed it, and then send a message back to the applicant, letting them know if it was a complete application, and if it was not, what was needed for it to be complete. And then the language would also say that once it was a complete application, a decision would have to be made within 30 days. Some of the problems with this is we currently inform applicants to allow between 30 to 45 days once we have a complete application. But for us to be able to provide that almost instantaneous review, we simply don't have the staffing at the BSRB to do that. And so I believe we would need to add additional staff members to be able to turn those around as quickly as the new language would require. And in terms of the language for the 30-day requirement that those would have to be issued, that's not always in an applicant's best interest. For example, if someone were to apply right now and they weren't going to meet the qualifications of licensure, but they would under one of the items in the bill, what we could say is we could put your application forward now, but it would be a denial. But if you are willing to wait, we could hold your application, and then if these changes go into effect, we could evaluate you under these new changes in law. But with the language that is currently being added by the legislature, we would have to do a mandatory decision within 30 days, which means we would have to deny more cases than we currently want to do. And then if individuals want to be licensed in the future, they would have to reapply, pay that fee again, produce additional documents. And I think I understand sort of the thought process behind it, but it creates some practical issues. The third item would be that it would call for the BSRB to develop a new type of license that's called a community-based license. And what this community-based license appears to do is it appears that it would function similar to a temporary license. It would be limited to no more than 24 months. It would be, under the original language, would be something that would be somewhat exclusive to community mental health centers. And it would be for individuals who are working under the scope of employment of a CMHC. They would have to be under the supervision of someone who's clinically licensed. But essentially, one of the major things that we focused on when we saw this language is that for those individuals with this new community-based license, these would be individuals who had not taken and passed the licensing examination, but according to the new language in the bill, they would be able to use the initials and the titles without qualification of a permanent license holder. And so it applies to the licensed psychology profession, professional counseling profession, marriage and family therapy profession, as well as the bachelor's and master's level of the social work profession. So if someone had this community-based license, they would be able to practice for certain facilities up to 24 months or until they pass the licensing examination. Currently, those individuals would have to have a temporary license, and when they describe themselves, they would have to say essentially a professional counselor temporary license. And with this new language, they would be able to just say that they were a professional counselor. And we had serious concerns about that item. And we raised those concerns with the legislature, but currently that has not been taken out or adjusted in regards to that. One of the major concerns, and we brought this forward to the board at the last board meeting, is that we had heard discussions that one of the reasons why this was being sought was to resolve certain billing issues. And we heard there may be some issues for certain reimbursements that were related to individuals having to describe themselves as a temporary license holder. And while I think I am sympathetic to why individuals would want to remove the qualification of having a temporary license, I think from a public protection standpoint, it's really important that the public knows which individuals have met all the requirements for a permanent license and which ones are still seeking that by going through and taking the licensing examinations. And so we've raised that issue. When it passed out of the House committee and was about to be on the floor, I reached out to the members of the leadership of that House Health Committee and requested amendments from them. They did not make any of those amendments on the House floor. On the Senate side, when it went to the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, I met with every single member of the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. For some of them, I even scheduled meetings in their office before the committee hearing and then after the hearing before they worked the bill, just to clarify what exactly the board was concerned about, what amendments we were seeking. And in my testimony for the committee, I even included copies of the exact amendments that could be made. But when they worked the bill, they did not make any amendments that I had requested from them. And so it did pass out of the Senate committee, but it did not pass the Senate floor. What that means is that it has not got to the point to where it would be sent to the governor, and House Bill 2340 on its own probably will not pass this year. However, because it passed one chamber, that means it's available to be put into essentially another bill when the legislature is conferencing on bills. When you go to conference committee on items of difference between bills, sometimes they're able to group other bills that have passed one chamber and put them together with other legislation. And last week, there was a flurry of activity in the legislature, and some of those meetings went as late as 4:30 in the morning. And so I did my best to track what transpired, but some of my work this week has been going back through and trying to see where things went. And I did find that there was a conference committee that did meet that dealt with some health bills. And the BSRB bill 2340 appears to have been included in the conference committee report of Senate Bill 131. And Senate Bill 131 includes a couple other health-related bills. But essentially, when that bill was put into the conference committee report for 131, there was some additional language added by the conference committee that would open up those community-based licenses even further and make them available not only to the CMHCs, but also individuals working under the scope of employment at a federally qualified health center, FQHCs, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, PRTFs, or private facilities as defined in KSA 59-29B46. And I'm not super familiar with that statute, so I'll have to do more research on that. But the effect of that language would be that it would open it up for more individuals to be able to seek these new community-based licenses. And I should qualify all of this by saying that that conference committee report did not pass, but the legislature is now at a time period to where they take about 2 weeks and they take a break. So they have a flurry of activity, then they step away for about 2 to 3 weeks, allow the governor the opportunity to review bills. The governor can either sign things into law, take no action, or veto certain bills. And then they come back and essentially can review any vetoes. They also can take any additional steps at a period called Omnibus. So that's what's going to happen at the end of this month. They're going to come back, review any items that are still remaining. And so this conference committee report on Senate Bill 131 is still available to be worked by the House and the Senate. At this point, I don't know if it will be worked, but that bill essentially includes not only the BSRB items, but other items relating to health too. And there are a lot of really good items in that bill that the board had recommended. There's also some items that are really challenging. And if that bill does pass, I think it would not be unexpected for us to approach the legislature asking for authority to add more staff members. And then to absorb some of those costs, I think we would also be seeking perhaps to talk to the board about maybe rolling back some of the fee decreases we had seen in previous years, or that we were going to be putting forward this year for some of the temporary licenses. You know, if we are held to a standard in the law to do things that quickly, I think we want to be responsive to that. But I think with my existing staff, there's 10 of us total, and I think we would need to add more people to be able to meet that standard. So I know that was a lot of information, but I think I'll go ahead and pause right now to see if you have any questions on the updates from the BSRB bill.
Thank you, Dave. That was a lot of info, quite overwhelming, I'm sure, for those of you who haven't been getting Dave's almost weekly updates. Do you have any questions? The LMLP group was left out of that list, Dave, is that correct?
For the community-based licenses?
Yes.
Yes, so the 4 groups that were included were the licensed psychology profession, the licensed professional counselor level of the professional counseling profession, the marriage and family therapist level of that profession, and then the bachelor's and master's level for the social work profession. So there was nothing in the bill for addiction counseling or master's level psychology or behavior analyst on that topic.
Professional counselors?
Yes, professional counselors, marriage and family therapy, licensed psychology, and then the bachelor's and master's level of social work.
The bachelor's level would qualify for that? Like, I'm having trouble grasping that.
Yeah, based on the wording that I had seen, it was that there would be a new community-based license, which would function essentially like a temporary license for bachelor's level social work applicants. And so they would still need to meet the other standards listed in that section. And I'll be totally transparent with you. This concept of a community-based license is not something that had been brought to the board or the advisory committees. We had not had a chance to work through this. So as best as we can try to understand this, it appears to be similar to a temporary license, but in terms of defining how this would actually work, other than the fact that it's limited to no more than 24 months, and it appears to be for individuals who have not passed the licensing examination yet, a lot of the defining characteristics just have not been really worked through. And that was part of our testimony to the committee too, and when these things happened in the House committee, I went ahead and reached out to the individuals that I believe were advocating for some of these changes and had further conversations to try to understand exactly what they were hoping to achieve by adding these items to the bill, to see if maybe we could work together to see if there could be some common ground, or perhaps, maybe there could be a compromise position on some of these things. And I think some of those conversations appeared that they were really positive. And I thought some of the changes I think were going to be received by the legislature in a positive way. But then when it came time for those amendments to be made, the amendments were not made by the legislature. So I can't really speak to that. I can just tell you that from our perspective, we've really had a lot of individuals this last year come to different committees and talk about compacts, talk about potential new license types. We've really met with a lot of people. And I think this is one of those things that I think, the board or the advisory committees, it would have been helpful for them to have information and have some time to really work through. This is just one of those things that we had very, very little time to really consider, and we still don't fully know exactly how it would be different from our existing license types.
Quick question, clarification. Under that, could a person originally apply for a temporary license, and then if they didn't pass the exam, try to get the community-based license and essentially extend that period for 4 years?
That was one of our questions too. Under the original way that it was written, when it was put in by the House committee, there was nothing that said that that could not take place. As I've been working through the language in that conference committee report, I've been trying to see if that item was addressed. The problem with conference committee reports is that they're not written like a traditional bill. It's written sort of like a weird summary where they say, on this page and this, add this text. And so it's kind of hard to see all of the possible changes. So I'm still working through that. I think from talking to people, the idea would be that it would be something you would get as opposed to a regular temporary license, that you would get one or the other, not that you would get one and then later you could get the other one. And I think maybe some of that has been the intention, but I'm not sure that was totally cleaned up in the newest version that conference committee reviewed. And I do think if we're able to do this under the scope of our ability to do regulations in terms of licensure, I think maybe spelling out some of these details, if this does actually go into law, that conference committee report has not been passed yet, but if it does get passed, we probably will need to have some good conversations about spelling out the distinctions of some of these topics.
Other questions? If not, we will move on to whole business.
Dave, I just had two quick comments. These are on other legislative items. Just want to make the committee aware of.
Okay, good.
And so I did want to make you aware of all the items with the BSRB bill, but I mentioned separately there were some other items that would affect the BSRB. One would involve a multi-state compact for professional counselors. There was another House Bill 2288, and that was for Kansas to join a licensure compact, multi-state compact for professional counseling at the clinical level. And that did pass both the House and the Senate. And that bill was sent to the governor, and I got a notification that I believe the governor signed that into law on Monday. So Kansas will be joining that compact, and I think the effective date on that was July 1st. So that compact is a fairly recent one. It is not fully functional yet, but that is something that we'll be working on in terms of allowing individuals to start to move forward with that once we have a little bit more of that defined. And then there is also one other bill that is House Bill 2375, and that is a similar bill to something in the BSRB bill. One of the members of the legislature used a portion of the language in the BSRB bill and created a separate bill, and this was specific to the social work profession that would involve those candidacy licenses for bachelor's and master's level individuals who got their education from a program that was in the process of becoming accredited by their national accrediting body. And so it also included some additional language, which would make it clear that individuals from online schools would be affected by that language too. And so That bill is in conference. I think there's very little of difference between the House version and the Senate version. And so I expect that bill to pass. That's just one other bill that's out there too, that if you hear a reference to that bill number, that would also be very similar to some of our language, but it's a much shorter bill as it just involves that one topic. So with that, I will go ahead and end my report.
Would you speak just briefly to the function of a compact and how that impacts people's ability to work in the state?
Sure. So, so I think, I'll start with kind of the basic framework and then kind of what makes the BSRB a little bit unique. I think a lot of professions that would involve occupational professions have more hands-on type work where you are going to be physically located in one state. And so we've had individuals who, let's say, move from one state to another. In some cases, military members or military spouses, where they move from one state, move to another, and they want to be able to practice right away. And this would be a way to help them get licensed more quickly by using a set of standardized criteria that as long as states have met that threshold, basically they would be able to get licensed more quickly if they were part of these compacts. With the BSRB, it's a little interesting because with the mental health professions, you don't need to be physically present to do a lot of the work. Individuals could be doing teletherapy from other states. And in fact, a large number of our licensees live out of state and provide services into Kansas doing telehealth type work. I think for the licensed psychology profession, I think about 30% of the licensees were from out of state. And so I think the effect of these compacts would mean that instead of having to get a license, some of these compacts allow someone to get a multi-state license. And so as long as you have a multi-state license, you would be able to practice into any of those states that are part of the compact. Other compacts are designed in a way in which, like the professional counseling one, you could get a privilege to practice in any compact states. And so basically you would still need to have a permanent license in your home state, but as long as you had a permanent license in your home state, you would be able to apply to the Compact Commission once it was fully established, and then be able to get a privilege to practice into any of those compact states that you wanted to practice in by paying a special fee. And so it would mean that you could go through the licensure process. It's a little bit different than a license, but essentially you'd go through the licensure process much more quickly. And essentially by meeting the standards of being part of the compact, it would mean that you could go through those steps without having the license body receive all the traditional information and have to review things the traditional way. So I think the benefit is that people could be licensed more quickly or be able to practice more quickly. And so for some of them, they're automatically able to practice in any of those compact states. For other ones, they would need to specifically choose which ones they would want to practice into, and it just speeds up the time frame for them being able to do that. And speaking of compacts too, there is one more compact that's in the works. There's a social work compact that the language was not finalized for this legislative session, but that did get finalized at the end of February. So it was too late for this year, but I expect that will probably come before the Kansas legislature sometime next year.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions on that? All right. We will move on to old business, and we wanted to have a brief discussion in follow-up to our last month, well, more than a month ago now, discussion on psychometricians. And Josh, you weren't able to be with us then, but we had a rather lengthy discussion about how trying to create a license for those folks, because they're operating into such diverse work settings and doing such different kinds of testing, might make it harder and actually create a situation where it'd be more difficult to get those people to be able to do that type of work because of BSRB having to create then lots of very specific definitions and regulations around that. Dave, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you summarized that well.
Any questions about that, Josh?
No, all good. Thank you for everyone discussing that.
No, appreciate you raising that topic. Okay, that takes us to new business. Dave, a discussion of recognizing APA accreditation from licensed psychology programs as satisfying accreditation standard for ML master's level psychology applicants.
And some of this, we'll start with kind of the general, we have a composite board with 7 professions. And for 5 of those professions, they recognize a national accrediting body, where if someone received their education from a program that's accredited by that national accrediting body, we can really expedite their review of their materials for licensure. The 2 that currently do not recognize a national accrediting body would be the addiction counseling profession and the master's level psychology profession. There is movement in that direction, but for the addiction counseling, they had recently met in the fall and looked at a possible accrediting body and recently made a recommendation to the board to go ahead and to recognize a specific accreditation body for addiction counselors. So that is going through the process right now. For master's level psychology, there really isn't one specific national accrediting body for the master's level psychology profession. The APA had announced last year that they were going to be looking at coming up with accreditation standards for master's level psychology programs to provide some uniformity for those. And I understand that the American Psychological Provincial and Psychology, ASPPB, has gone ahead and formed a task force to assist APA with that process in terms of looking at master's level psychology programs, because basically there's only about 17 states that license master's level psychologists. So it's not a uniform standard between states, but that task force is looking at what are states doing right now? Are there uniform standards perhaps we can look at to be helpful to the APA as they go through that process? And so later this year, I think the APA is hopeful to be able to release some language, at least in draft form, maybe for comment. But while that's going on right now, there is no national accrediting body for the master's level psychology. However, we do have individuals who apply for licensure at master's level psychology level who had received their education from programs that are accredited by the APA for licensed psychology programs. And they have asked the BSRB, well, these would clearly meet for licensed psychology profession. Why don't they meet for master's level psychology? And we clarify to them that, well, we have to go by what's in law. And for the licensed psychology statutes and regulations, they identify certain criteria for national accrediting body, and we can expedite those ones. But for master's level psychology, currently there's no similar language, even if that program was accredited or that would satisfy for licensed psychology. So wanted to kind of bring it up for the discussion for you to see what your thoughts were on that, if that's something that you think might be beneficial or appropriate for the licensing board to evaluate the programs if some individuals applied for a master's level psychology license, but had received their education from a program that was accredited and would satisfy the criteria for if they would have applied for a licensed psychology license. So curious to hear your thoughts on that as professionals in this area.
Just a clarification too, Dave. So when those applications come, that means that the BSRB staff are sending to the university a lengthy questionnaire about whether their program meets all of the specific criteria for a master's level program.
Right. For the other professions, what we essentially would say is, if the person received their education from a program accredited by the national accrediting body, we'll go ahead and advance them forward. If they attended a program that's not accredited, they will have to meet these specific requirements and regulation. For the master's level psychology, there really is no path A that would be recognizing a national accrediting body. So they do go to essentially path B, which means we would need to collect more information if it was not a program that we had already reviewed and ensured that it met the standards. And so if we get new programs, we have to go through that process to verify that that individual did get the appropriate education. And sometimes that process of sending questionnaires back to the school, collecting them, following up, and then having someone review those materials, that can take additional time. So one of the main benefits is that if at some point, if there is a national accrediting body for master's level psychology, that would help us from a licensing perspective. It would also help us make sure that we're doing things consistently, but also more quickly too.
Very good. Comments?
Any thoughts around any hint of optimism about a subdivision of the American Psychological Association being the regulatory body? Is that something that we could, at a national level, partner with our doctoral level colleagues?
You mean in terms of them functioning as an accrediting body for master's level
Well,
psychology?
to just model what happens currently at the doctoral level, licensing and regulatory oversight over programs, if that could happen at the master's level too, with appropriately different standards, like where relevant. I know there's a long history there, but I feel like things are moving in a direction where I see a lot of partnership. So, and certainly happy to raise that question up the flagpole with friends at APA too, and to see, is that something, to me, it would be nice to see the profession of psychology, of practicing clinical psychology to have a little bit more cohesion from the master's to the doctoral continuum of that training program. You know, we share a licensing exam, we share a lot of the same things, we share an ethics guideline. Be cool to share standards for what would be sort of at the T, you know, if I think of people maybe that I've hired before that had had completed a program to become a doctoral level psychologist, but for whatever reason, let's say that they passed the EPPP at the master's level as opposed to the doctoral level, we're pursuing LMLP licenses, and know that I've watched others kind of do that too, and thinking that there's a lot of synergy. It'd be nice to work together, not apart, but one day.
Well, and I mentioned there's 17 states that license master's level psychologists, and talking to other states at some of the National Association conferences. We are also a little unique within that 17 in that we license 2 different levels of the master's level psychology. Because some of the states I was talking to that do license master's level, they don't license at a clinical level for master's level. So there is still a little bit of division even in that regard too.
That makes sense. I mean, that's helpful information.
And I can tell you the conversations that I have heard as well, in terms of establishing a standard. I think one of the things they've tried to make clear is that they're not trying to make a standard to force all the 17 states to have to meet that. But if they do want to recognize national standards, they want to be helpful in making sure that there is some consistency between states. So.
I agree. I think as we try to manage through the workforce shortages, people being able to, who meet the qualifications clearly, to be able to have a process to expedite getting that license in place, right? We're not talking about necessarily new to the field. We're just adding another state to our ability to practice. And from a practice location sitting on a state line, we couldn't wait for the site compact to go in place where our doctoral level psychologists will be covered on both sides of the state line. So I think compacts are good for healthcare and for getting licensed people into roles that we certainly are having a shortage of getting people into, from nursing to social work to our profession as well.
Other questions, feedback? So the issue before us is, do we want to put forward that we would accept people who are coming out of APA approved PhD level psychology programs who apply for LMLPs and accept those because they're meeting the standardized, credentialed, nationally certified for the LP. If they apply for an LMLP, will we accept that so we don't have to go through the process of having staff send them the questionnaires, gathering all that information and slowing that process down?
I think that makes sense.
I think that would be beneficial just because, obviously if the university is I don't want to say accredited because I don't mean, APA accredited, but, if the university is a master's program and they have, they've met criteria, they're following, the guidelines, it would certainly do a service to the community and clients that we serve if we were able to, broaden our reach. But we also want to make sure that, we're following, all of us are following the same guidelines so that we are doing best practice. So I think it is worth pursuing.
And just to clarify, these are APA credentialed programs.
Yes.
So they would meet all the criteria for the licensed psychologists, the PhDs. They have applied for LMLP status, and maybe for the reason Lauren indicated, if they took the EPPP and passed it at a level where they could get licensed in the beginning as a LMLP, this would allow them to do that and would allow us to accept that universities and not have to go through that secondary process of having staff send them the questionnaire to see if they meet all the criteria. Josh?
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. The only the only thought I had was, just the internship would be the only question for me, whether they have those hours of practical experience, because so that would be the only thing I would wonder about, because from what I gather, what's being asked is a lot of times when you go to, of course, a PhD program, you get your master's en route to your PhD. But I don't know how much how much regulation there is what happens in those first 2 years or whatever, right? So, and I don't know how much variation there is from program to program. So my only question would be just checking it's not 100% classroom work, right? And then they're applying for a license.
I believe that there is the intern portion of the program where they're collecting their hours, and then kind of at the point in the program where we would have historically started our practicums, that you could sort of consider the postdoc. A plethora of clinical experience. I do think it would be good to find out exactly when the time frame is that has all happened pre-licensure, but I can at least attest that KU's doctoral psychology program, our doctoral students are doing their internships in their second and third years. So I think they would have the equivalent practicum experience. Do we also need to look at it from the other perspective of the 17 states, assuming that some of those 17 states have master's programs that aren't connected to any regulatory body at all, maybe even some that are all online? Do we need to understand if there's an online master's only LMLP program in any of the 17 states that would cause back to the problem we're trying to figure out in our state around in-kind experience.
Are you referring to like a reciprocity issue?
Well, yeah, if we're looking at compacts, well, at sort of blessing or institutions, right? Educational institutions that they've sort of got the pre-approved curriculum. Wouldn't we want to do that at all of them, not just the ones that have doctoral programs connected to them? If a master's in psychology is what you end up completing your training at before licensure?
So Dave, you had mentioned something. So if an applicant from a university is seeking licensure and your staff just did a licensure for somebody from that exact same program, do you go back and gather all the same information, or since you have that on record, do you use that information?
So it depends if the program has met recently or if the program did not meet. If the program met, then we would accept that as a standard. If the program did not meet, we would want to send a questionnaire to see if they had made any changes, so that way we're evaluating it unique to each individual. So I think for individuals that we can approve, we can kind of have a little bit of flexibility to be able to expedite them. But I think if there's some individual we think we might deny, we want to take the extra step to see if we can find a way to license them if we can. So
does that answer your question, Lauren?
Yeah, it sounds like there's still a pathway. That's good. Thank you.
So do we want, in regard to Josh's question, to look to see when the classes that are required for our state programs are occurring in these PhD programs, as well as the practicum and internships, to make sure that they have kind of an equivalency? And if so, then kind of bless those programs.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. I'm not trying to make more work for you and your staff. Just, I think so. You know, that there is quite a bit of variation among programs. I think, you know, so it'd be interesting to see what you guys find, I guess.
yeah, well, and this is, you know, it's perfectly fine for us to start this conversation today. So a lot of the actual reviewing of the applications is done by more of my staff. And Leslie Allen does a lot of work on this topic too. So I mentioned she's out a little on vacation, which is great. You know, everybody should take vacation. But when she comes back, I can have conversations with her about this topic, and she and I can research this a little bit more, and then maybe bring something back for your next meeting. And she may already have knowledge on this topic. Probably she does. And so I'll talk to her a little bit more about that. We'll bring something back for you next meeting if you want us to go ahead and do that.
We used to take doctoral interns here, and I don't recall ever seeing anybody that did not have practicum internship hours at that level. So I believe that it's probably, you know, especially those that are accredited, that it would be a part of that, but probably doesn't hurt to make sure.
Yeah. Very good. All right, we'll move on to a discussion about adding an additional member to our advisory committee. I think Dave has talked about this in the past. We can have as many as 10 members, and what, as few as, is it 4 or 6?
So there's board members who serve on the advisory committee, and then there's non-board members. And for the non-board members, there needs to be at least 3, and there can be a maximum of 10. And so when you're looking at the non-board members on the advisory committee, there's currently 6. And so you are higher than the floor. So you wouldn't need to add any new members, but you definitely have a little bit of room You could add as many as 4, or you could add fewer than that if you were looking at adding any new members.
And one of the things we talked about in the past was kind of if we were adding people in a staggered formation, it allowed then for us not to do what we did the last time, which is kind of change everybody out all at once, which means you lose some kind of historical perspective for folks who've been on. How do people feel about adding an additional member?
I think that'd be great.
And my memory is when we added Travis, we can reach out to a few people to see if they had continued interest. Dave, is that right?
Yes, and could tell you in a second here how many other individuals applied last time. Looks like that was back in May of 2022. So 3 individuals had applied for consideration, and Travis was appointed. So there were 2 other individuals from that time period. And so you could consider those 2 individuals, or you could open it up and have me send something out to all licensees, but it's kind of your preference as a committee, which way you'd like to go on that one.
The other 2 folks,
I'm a fan of sending it out to everyone because I just like people at different levels of their career path to have opportunities to join and bring a different perspective.
so it makes sense to me maybe to add one now and then look at this again in a year. And then that way we're kind of making sure that we're not adding a lot of people at the same time. And Lauren is advocating for us kind of sending out a general request to see who would like to serve. People comfortable with that?
Yes.
And one thing I can do to help you out in this process too, so I'll just draft a message and send it out to all licensees at the master's level and licensed clinical psychotherapists as well. But I'll send personal messages to the 2 other individuals who applied last time to see if they're still interested. And then if they are still interested, after I've given everyone a chance to submit a letter of interest and a resume or a CV, I will go ahead and send those materials to all of you for your review. And then if the individuals who had applied last time are still interested, I'll make a special mark by them so you'll know who was interested last time, who's applying again this time.
Great. All right, that takes us to a discussion on changes to clinical training plans.
Yes, so there is a regulation for your profession. It is 102-4-7A, and it describes postgraduate supervised professional work experience and clinical training plans. At the very end of that regulation, this would be under H. There is language that says, all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within that 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice, beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And so what we have seen over time has been some confusion, not exclusive to your profession, but just across different professions that have to submit training plans and have them approved, is that individuals will submit a training plan, it will be approved, and then as they go along, there is some modification, whether it is significant or slight. And based on the language in the regulation, if there is a change, they're required to submit something to the board to make sure that that change to their training plan is approved. And at times, if they have failed to do that, basically it says you have to do that within 45 days. And if you don't, the hours after that are not going to count. But there are some small changes that, if you're moving from office A to office B, but you're not really changing anything else, is that really a change that's significant enough to report to the board? If you're moving from location A to location B, and that's in a totally different place, there's just questions that come up as far as what types of changes really should be included in terms of all changes. And part of this is we talked to the board at the last meeting and said, having this further defined could be helpful for everybody involved. From the applicant's perspective, it would make sure they have clear guidance that if something happens, they know for sure that they would need to report that. From a supervisee's perspective, they could be aware of this too, and also point that out, that if someone gets a new supervisor, they could say, this was spelled out in the regulation, you should be aware of this, make sure that you report it. And from a licensing board perspective, if we do have individuals that come to us and say, well, I just didn't know, we can point to them as far as a clear standard. And it also helps my staff in terms of how to advise people if they have questions on this. And so, so we thought, as opposed to just saying all changes, we thought it could be helpful for the advisory committees to have a discussion on this point and try to identify some possible items that could constitute changes that would need to be reported to the board. And I did talk to Joan Hahn, who's our licensing specialist who works with the clinical level of practitioners or applicants. And I asked her if she could put together sort of a list of different things as a starting point. And so I will go ahead and share my screen here. This is just kind of to help some of the discussion, but some of the items that she identified that could be possible changes that would need to be reported could include things like if someone has a new or additional work site. Another possible change could be that would need to be reported as a change in position at the approved work site. Another one could be a change in duties or responsibilities at the approved work site. A new or additional supervisor, adding something like group supervision after the training plan is approved, or the supervisee is no longer accruing hours towards clinical licensure, either because they're taking a break or they're just stopping. And so, as opposed to someone who makes a mistake and then they come back later and they lose a number of hours, we thought this would be helpful for you all to have a conversation. And this doesn't have to be exclusive to today, but thought we could start this today and see what your thoughts were on possible changes you thought would be helpful for us to really kind of spell out in the regulation, or your thoughts on this topic in general. And then I think one of the other items that at least one of the board members mentioned at the last board meeting was the current language of the regulation essentially says that if a supervisee fails to submit a change to the board within the 45 days, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on that date. The changes took effect through the date to which the change to the plan are approved by the board, which is a very definitive statement there in terms of how those hours will be treated, but it can have the effect of individuals losing a lot of hours. And I don't know if there is a better solution for that, but if you are aware of anything, or if you have thoughts on that, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, I have thoughts, of course. I think these examples are great. I think it would be nice to give applicants a very clear understanding of what changes to their training plan they need to let the board know about. I think those of us that got our clinical license just assumed it meant literally every change, and better safe than sorry. But I do think we live in less of a better safe than sorry world, and giving people very specific examples might help. I think the list could include more things than that. So like with everything else, we'd want to asterisk it with, and anything else that could significantly change or alter your practicum experience. I mean, knowing that no list could ever be 100% conclusive.
Yeah, what my thought is, what I noticed maybe is the ratio of client contact versus supervision. It does talk about taking a break and stuff, but there is like so many hours with most of them of client contact, and the ratio to, so if that ratio changes, maybe having to submit that.
That's a good call out. I've had employees say that just changing rules would impact their client contact hours, which would then impact their clinical supervision. So I think that's a good call out. So like changing ratio of
Client
client contact hours.
to supervision. There you go. Yep.
Thank you. And each of the advisory committees is having a discussion on this as it applies to their professions. We're hoping to bring some comments back, and then the board can have a discussion about having a uniform standard. But yeah, any comments you have on this topic right now, that'd be helpful for us.
I was wondering about the term work site versus something like agency or organization. To me personally, I don't see. It seems I don't know why we would need to let the board know if we're having an additional work site at the same agency. That seems a little superfluous to me. Like if I'm working for a major community health, CMHC, and I start seeing people at an outpost office, like that seems to me it's something to me that could be easily missed by someone because it's a very small change. It wouldn't seem to, I don't know why we would need to let the BSRB know that. I was going to say the same thing for change in position at an approved work site until Iris said I could see the ratio of client contact hours changing and supervision hours changing. So it might be good to let the BSRB know that because the plan might take longer or whatever. But my thought is if there are changes within the same agency, if they're staying at the same agency and there are changes within that agency, then to what extent would we need to let the BSRB know about that? I mean, they're still seeing people if they want to get their LCP, they're working for the same agency, they're doing the same, those are changes I feel like people would miss. And I think that's what you're trying to prevent, are people missing things. But I don't know. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree, Josh.
I think you're right, because the only time that would be important would be, let's say your agency is so big that it also meant your clinical supervisor was changing. Well, obviously that is a different reason because that's already on the list and that would be a change in supervisor. You're right, I can't think of another instance.
Yeah, I agree with what Josh said. I think as somebody who works in an agency with 6 full-time offices, moving from one office to the other didn't seem very significant to me. And even it seemed like what Iris raised as being the caveat for kind of any change. So is the change in position important? It is if it impacts that, if you get a new supervisor or if you get a change to client contact. But otherwise, as Josh indicated, it may not be. So maybe it's the kind of qualitative things that we're really looking at, not just what they're doing or where they're doing it.
I guess if it invalidated anything on your original application, that's worth knowing. And it's been a very long time, but I feel like maybe one of the questions that I had to explain in my plan was the age and gender of the patients I'd be treating during my experience. So I guess if something was going to qualitatively change or truncate down an answer you'd put on your original application. I mean, I guess that's why I took it pretty literal. Like if something changes, you notify the board. Because I think that could be relevant.
It might also beg the question then, if the board really wants to streamline this and not have so many confusion, maybe the application needs to be simplified to some degree too. Or there can be, like, I guess it's relevant. I remember it was a while ago for me to, you know, what age of people you are working with. But I guess that's my question for the board, David, is, does the board really care about that? Or do they just care that you're seeing people and that you're doing clinical work?
Yeah, I know we've had some conversations about forms, and perhaps efforts to change certain forms to make them perhaps more yes or no questions as a way to streamline some of that and make it more succinct. So here within the agency, we do have conversations on that. I don't think we have any immediate changes that are going to be coming up here, but that is something we talk about behind the scenes, is, you know, what information do we really need? What is totally necessary? And is there a way to ask some of the things we need to ask to get the information we need without opening it up and having people spend a lot more time, you know, writing the information, but also for our staff reviewing that information, if we can be more direct at getting to what we need.
And I think about it, I'm really forced myself to think about, you know, the purpose of this is the protection of the public, right? I don't see that changing, protecting the public anymore, whether I see children or adults. And that's my training amendment. That's my training plan, you know.
Yeah, when you pull up the plan, because it's been I'm so long, I'm so aged through this. I don't think that I had a training plan. I was before that. So looking through, it's like there's 17 pretty big questions, and it does get specific on, are you diagnosing, are you list the specific diagnoses that you expect to treat. So I think somebody brought that up. You know, if that changes, would you want to have to notify what services? What if you weren't doing testing before and now you are going to be doing testing? Yeah, theories. Okay, I was using some CBT, but now I'm using solution focus. You know, there's just there's a lot of questions within that plan.
And I would argue in our profession, those questions mean more than they might in other professions. So because we take the same licensing exam as our doctoral level colleagues, and we get to call them colleagues, right? Those things are all part of what we would have done if we had completed a doctoral program. And so what we're asking the public to do is to trust us, because we passed the EPPP at the doctoral level and because we've had this training. So in this training, we're saying is, well, does the public care if it's with adults or children? I'd say probably, or else there wouldn't be child psychology programs and huge divisions of the APA dedicated to subspecialties. So I don't think it needs to be a barrier, but I do think our trainees knowing that, yeah, it was the work of slaving over that, 12-page document and figuring out how I was going to get from a little LMLP level to my brain being able to learn and perform tests I hadn't learned in graduate school, things that I was learning from my doctoral level clinical supervisor. And so, I mean, I guess if my supervisor hadn't been doctoral level, then me doing the R-bands probably wouldn't have been a good thing because I wouldn't have been appropriately supervised. So I guess I thought that some of protecting the public was making sure that that training plan was realistically preparing that person to be in an unsupervised clinical role at the end of it. And I value it in a way that I think it can be very helpful for the acceptance of our profession. There's things we get to do that we wouldn't in some of the other roles. And
that's a good reminder, Lauren. Maybe on the application, David, there could be like, I guess that's what we're talking about, but is there a section that the board wants applicants to think about, but is perhaps in this area of, okay, but you don't have to let us know when you do change something, about it. So like, yeah, I remember putting on my application, I was going to get trained and certified in DBT stuff and whatever, and I did. But like Iris is saying, if I would have just not, never, I think that's good to think through for the training plan, right? But do I feel like it's worth anybody else's time, including mine, to submit to the board that, well, I'm actually not going to use that much. I'm going to use CBT a lot more. I don't know if that's the case, but I think the process of I think what Lauren was saying is the process of doing that and thinking about your goals throughout that theoretical 2-year process of becoming an LCP is important.
Dave, do you have any idea of how often when a training plan is revised that it is not accepted?
I don't. I can talk to Joan and kind of get some feedback from her on that.
Because what we're really talking about here is people who've either forgotten or neglected to do that.
Mhm.
Okay, and so part of my question is, if they had, would it have been accepted? And if it would, should we penalize them for all those hours simply because they didn't? So let's say they didn't, they forgot, and then BSRB becomes aware, or they figure it out and go, I should have told you 6 months ago that this happened. I didn't submit a revision to my plan. And BSRB looks at it and says, well, had you submitted that, we would have approved it. Why would we punish people and push them back 6 months for that? That's kind of my question. Now, if BSRB says, yeah, we would not have approved that, well, then sure, because they wouldn't have gotten credit for those hours anyway. The question for me really is, it sounds like it's being raised because some people are saying, well, that was a minor change in my opinion in what I was doing. I didn't think it mattered. But now that it's been discovered, I'm going to lose all of this. That seems punitive.
I imagine there's also a group of people who are frustrated because if they'd have known it didn't count, they would have wanted the BSRB to tell them right away, and they didn't tell the BSRB, so the BSRB couldn't say, no, that change can't be made, and you've wasted the last 6 weeks. There's something to be said about being able to manage yourself at an independent level. Writing a plan, sticking to it, meeting the timelines, and updating people when things change are really reasonable professional things. So we're not talking about like how many free chances you can order your transcripts and have them sent to BSRB. This is, you've been out of graduate school, you've taken the licensing exam, you're practicing, you've gotten someone to agree to be your clinical supervisor, you've drafted a 17-page plan.
However, I think in some of our workplaces, and I think Iris would agree with me, we plug people in where there's a need, and it may be, as Josh indicated, you're going to serve now people in this office that's in the next town. And so how much of that change is significant enough to require that? And I know where I work, that could happen several times, and it may have nothing to do with the clinician. We just got a notification from one of the agencies, a primary care clinic, where we've been sending a therapist who just sent us a letter and said, hey, I need that space, so I'm booting you out. And so that clinician is now going to go somewhere else to serve. And so would that be significant enough change? Because they're now going to be in a different location.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there are some changes that are de minimis and probably don't matter. I think there are some that are pretty constitutional and do matter.
Yeah, and I hear the conversation. This is really helpful because we have had individuals who've been very unhappy that they've lost a number of hours, and we definitely don't want that to happen. We've had some conversations here as if there's anything that we could bring forward as a possible solution to this. And in talking to some of my staff, you know, one possibility would be if we had some, you know, mandatory reporting times as opposed to the beginning and then the end, but to have some checks in place along the path. The only problem with that is that if you require some of those check-ins at certain points, it means that there's a lot more documentation flowing to the BSRB, which means a lot more staff time to be taken reviewing those things. And so it's just kind of weighing, how do you want to prioritize staff time, and you know, would this be, is it more beneficial to help the individuals that could fall into those categories so they wouldn't lose all of their time, versus putting on a mandatory requirement for a lot of people that are not going to have any issues with their plan? And so those are some of the things that we've kind of had conversations about internally as something. Is this, would be helpful to propose this, or is this something that maybe we can come at it a different way? And so I think one of our ways that coming at it a different way was maybe looking at this conversation today and seeing, can we spell out more of these things so that there's more clarification up front, so individuals, you know, can be reminded of what exactly they should be remembering to report. That way they're not losing a lot of hours at the tail end of it too.
Is there a way, Dave, in the system to flag people who have those and send automatic like reminder emails that would say, don't forget if you have substantial changes to your workplace, or and list out those things that could go out to them? So it wouldn't require a great deal more effort on your staff if you get automated, and it might reduce the number of people who would get too far along in that process before they went, oh man, I needed to have.
So you're talking about having something that we could put in the system for individual approved training plan, that periodically they might receive an automated email from the BSRB that says, you're in the system under a training plan. Please be mindful of this regulation, that any changes you would need to provide. I will look into that. It's not something that we have done in the past, but I'll look to see if we could do that.
Well, it seems like your system reminds people when their license is about to expire. And again, it then deals with Lauren's issue of, you know, they do need to have some personal responsibility. Doesn't hurt to have a reminder, but doesn't also then burden your staff with having to do more work and overly burden people who have submitted a plan, are following that plan, to provide documentation that they're doing what they said they were doing. And it reduces how bad we're going to feel about people who don't do it. And then 6 months later, we have to say to them, we're not going to get any credit. And by the way, we did remind you several times during that period. So that's again on you.
I think
will
it's,
work on cultivating empathy for those that are needing help, not falling off their plan. I've had an exorbitant amount of people think that anyone with a BSRB license can just start, and that somehow the BSRB will retrospectively grant them permission to have never had a training plan in the first place. I run into about 10 people a year licensed by BSRB that really believe that. I'll say, where are you at with your clinical supervision? These are not LMLPs. I won't name the most common schools, but there are a lot of people that really think that. And so having that really upfront, clear guidance, I think really helps us more than we know. I think there's a lot of people we don't know that are sitting there thinking, I'm almost done with my however many thousand hours and I'll be a clinically licensed soon. And then they find out they haven't put a training plan. And then they come to me and we start a training plan.
and they restart the whole thing all over. So I think that it's a good thing for learning to be professional and responsible too. There's a win-win here.
I think the other piece that I was just going to mention is I'm not sure what happens once they apply for that LCP, but what do you look at that you evaluate that you did accomplish what you were supposed to get that LCP? Do you look at all 17 areas of that training plan, or do you look at like 11 through 14 more heavily? And those might kind of answer what you need to require more as far as letting you guys know what the changes are.
Good point.
It's a great discussion, all. Anybody have any other comments, or are we ready to move? All right, we'll move on to a discussion on regulations. The first one having to do with continuing education.
And so this is in part because last year the legislature was really taking a look at agencies if they were being mindful about reviewing regulations. And last year we looked through a certain number of regulations to see if they should be updated. And this year, one of the items that I'll be bringing forward to each of the advisory committees is to look at their regulation on continuing education. So for your profession, that is KAR 102-4-10A, and that regulation identifies the number of continuing education hours that are required. It also talks about essentially activities that would be approved for continuing education hours. And there are 14 different items that are listed under this. There's also a little bit of information about what would not qualify for continuing education. Under section G, it says continuing education approval shall not be granted for any of the following activities: first aid, infection control, occupational health and safety courses, in-state service, and the training is for job orientation or job training specific to the employing agency, or any activity for which the licensee cannot demonstrate to the board's satisfaction the program goals and objectives are to enhance the licensee's psychological practice, values, skills, ethics, and knowledge. Now, this list of approved items and the regulation itself was last updated back in 2008. And so what I'm asking each of the advisory committees to do is to review that regulation on continuing education, see if the language still accurately describes certain activities that should be meeting the standards of continuing education. Also, I have started to have some preliminary conversations with other boards in other states to see what they do in terms of what they allow for continuing education. And for some states, they allow a certain number of continuing education for things that appear to be more geared towards community service. I'm not saying that that's something that I would recommend or endorse, but just for perspective, there's one state that I received an email about that was asking if any other states give continuing education time during elections for licensees that may want to volunteer to work at an election poll the night of an election. So I know that there are some states that provide some ability to get continuing education hours for things that may be directly, may not be directly related to education, perhaps. One of the other items that some of the other professions are looking at, for the social work profession, we had received reports last year that some individuals were struggling to pass the licensing examination to get licensed. And so one way that we thought we could spotlight this issue would be to allow a certain number of hours of continuing education for individuals who are licensed, who are mentoring or coaching those who are studying to take the exam, especially those that are having trouble passing it. So if you are someone who is acting as a coach or a mentor for individuals that are taking the licensing examination or are working to take it, the social work profession recommended allowing up to 8 hours every license period total, not per person, but just total, as a way that we could be helpful as a board to reward those that are already doing it and encourage those who may be helpful to help individuals so they can pass the test and become licensed. And so, so that's just an example of something else that could potentially be included on your list as well in terms of what would qualify for continuing education. But just kind of wanted you to review that to see if the language is still current, if any information should be taken out. And then also, are there anything that you're aware of from other jurisdictions that you think would make sense to add to the regulation? And if I hear other items discussed by other advisory committees, I can bring this back to you. But this is more or less kind of like a homework item to look at between now and the next meeting, and then come back ready to discuss it a little more thoroughly.
Dave, is that the same reg that talks about the number of CE hours?
It is, yeah. 102-4-10A. It does include an A that there's a required number of 50 hours.
I'd like us to think about that as well. Some professions are requiring 30. I mean, we are substantially higher than that. It doesn't prevent people from getting additional hours. We're really trying to set a floor here, not a ceiling. We're kind of out of step with what our other master's level professions are requiring. So think about that if you would as well. Okay, we'll move on to documentation for continuing ed.
Okay. So 6 of the 7 professions have an accompanying regulation to their continuing education that is titled documentation for continuing education or documentation of continuing education. For your profession, that's KAR 102-4-11A, and it's a half a page regulation. It's fairly short, but I thought it made sense to go ahead and include it as part of this discussion. But it outlines about, let's say, 10 or so ways that individuals can verify completion of continuing education or provide proof to the board. Should they get audited, they can use these items to demonstrate they have completed it. Now, this regulation was last updated in 1997. So I think over the last, 26 years, there have probably been some changes in terms of electronic CEs and internet content. And so specifically with technology in mind, it may be helpful to review this regulation and see if perhaps there's things that should be rephrased, or perhaps new items in terms of a way to, be helpful for the board. And part of this is that currently, if individuals are selected for audit, some of those individuals have to mail to the board office documentation to show evidence of completion of all these different things. We're looking at some other methods that would help with that process, but for the current time, a lot of that information has to be provided to the board office and reviewed. But we don't want individuals to be unclear that if they are audited, what they have to provide. If they don't have to send us 500 pages of material or over 1,000 pages of material, we don't want them to do that. That's an extra cost to them, and it's extra work for my staff. And so if we can really figure out what needs to be included in here and just kind of clean it up, I think that would be helpful.
Next, we have use of computerized psychological testing. You'll be amazed at how old this reg is.
So for both of the licensed psychology profession and the master's level psychology profession, there is a regulation on the use of computerized psychological tests. And this regulation is KAR 102-4-13. And just as an example of something that would need to be cleaned up, this was last acted on back in 1997. So if you think about the last 26 years and what has changed with computerized psychological testing, or just computers in general, as an example, under item B1, the regulation states to utilize computers in any aspect of psychological testing, the master's level psychologists shall also meet all of the following requirements. And under number 1, it says conform to the standards for education and psychological testing as copyrighted by the American Psychological Association in 1985 and reprinted in July of 1996 and hereby adopted for reference. So I would assume there has been hopefully a later revision since 1996 that perhaps we can at least update that reference. But if you see other changes in this regulation, it's a very short one. It's only half a page. But if you don't mind reviewing that regulation and coming in ready to discuss possible edits, and we'll also do the same from our office, but kind of wanted to ask you to look at that for some possible changes.
Very good. For those people who aren't here today, they've, I know that'll be included in the minutes, but sometimes those are a little slower in getting to people. Maybe we could send them just a reminder to review those.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and send a follow-up email to the members of the committee that I'll just send it to all the members of the committee and just go ahead and attach a copy of those regulations as well as the clinical training plan as well. And then just kind of describe briefly what we talked about at this meeting and then just let them know to go ahead and review those for the next meeting with possible edits in mind.
Great. Yeah, I think it's, incumbent upon us, and I appreciate your raising those specific issues so that we keep our regs as up to date as we can. And I know that there are some legislators who are very interested in regs and making sure that they stay up to date. So I think this is good work for our committee.
There was one bill that did pass last year that it would not sunset the regulations. That was a different bill that had been discussed, but there was a bill that put all agencies on a periodic review. And so every, I believe, 5 or 6 years, each of those years, a different number of agencies come up for review, and they have to put together a report and submit to the legislature that would go through all of their regulations and identify if each regulation is necessary for the implementation of state law. And if not, they're supposed to take action to repeal different things in that. So we are up in fiscal year 2026. So we have a little bit of time, but if we approach them in a reasonable pace and go through them and have good, thoughtful conversations, when it comes to that year, we should have all the work already done and be able to defend anything in the regulations.
That's the old saying, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
That's right.
Okay, you had next discussion on topics for 2023.
Yeah, and so I wanted to bring forward some regulations for review and get your comments and have you just be mindful about us working through those. But if there was going to be anything else that the advisory committee wanted to discuss, I wanted to have a little bit of time. If you had any things in particular you wanted us to look at, anything I can talk to my staff about as far as bringing back information to discuss at a future meeting. So if you have items in mind, we could have a little discussion today. It's definitely something that we could talk about the next meeting, but if you had things in mind you wanted us to deal with as an advisory committee, wanted to give you all an opportunity to provide those thoughts.
You had mentioned, Dave, that the social work profession is having some discussions around the use of their current national exam as the test authors have opened up their data and seems to indicate that certain groups don't do as well on that test as other groups, which is called into question whether or not it could be used in the manner that it's currently being used. And I had a couple of people ask me about the EPPP and if we knew about the data in regard to that exam. Have you read anything or seen anything about disparities in how groups do on that?
As far as a wide scope, I have not. What ASWB released in terms of the social work profession was pretty unique. A lot of the other professions have not really released similar data that broke it down by demographics in quite the same way. I think, if I recall right, this was a few months ago, but I think another board member, Rick Steele, I think he had maybe a document, maybe it was an article where they had maybe looked at a small sample of some individuals who had taken the EPPP. So I'll go back and I'll look for that. I seem to recall that there was something that he had made a reference to at a board meeting. So I'll look to see if I can find that. But in terms of sort of a broad scope over all applicants or all individuals who had taken it, I don't think there's something similar for the other professions, as definitely not for the EPPP that I'm aware of.
And did I recently read that there's going to be a second part to the EPPP that is going to be required? It's a practice piece.
So there's the EPPP, and then there's something that has been referred to as the EPPP 2, and the EPPP. And this is a little bit before my time working for the BSRB, so I'm kind of communicating what I have heard from trying to become knowledgeable on some of these things. But as it's been kind of explained to me, the EPPP is more of a knowledge-based test, and EPPP 2 was intended to be sort of a standardized skills-based test. And I think one of the reasons it was developed was there were some jurisdictions that were doing, let's say, an oral examination, and the defensibility of some of that was called into question in terms of if it was standardized, if it was non-biased. And so some individuals were saying it would be helpful to have a way to evaluate skills-based abilities independent of knowledge-based abilities. And so ASPPB had come up with an EPPP 2, but it was not mandatory for jurisdictions to have as a requirement. And there was a push a few years back where there was conversation about making it mandatory, and there was a lot of pushback, and they decided they would not make it mandatory at that time. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And that they would reevaluate it in 2022 or 2023. I forget which one it was. It's probably 2022. And so when that happened, they went ahead and had some town halls, and they collected information, and they allowed some jurisdictions to go ahead and choose to add it as a requirement if they chose to do so. And some jurisdictions did. And so for them, it is a part of what's required in terms of becoming licensed in those jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions could voluntarily, they called it early adopt, or voluntarily choose to implement it. But last fall, ASPPB board, they voted and decided that as of January 1st of 2026, any jurisdictions that want to continue to use the EPPP, if you're using the first part of it, there's a new terminology change as well, that instead of it being the EPPP and the EPPP 2, it would be one exam, and that there would be the EPPP part 1 and then the EPPP part 2. And for jurisdictions that want to continue to use the EPPP as the national standard licensing examination, if you were using part 1, you would also need to require part 2. However, they have, questions did come up as part of that discussion about jurisdictions that have master's level psychology licensure and that use the EPPP for that. Because especially for master's level psychologists that are not at the clinical level, it sounded like some of the items for the EPPP 2 were testing some of the skills in terms of practicing at a clinical level. And if you're not practicing at a clinical level as a master's level psychologist, how can you evaluate that? So there are these questions that have been raised. They said that they are still working through that. For Kansas, there has not been any conversation yet as far as moving to include the EPPP 2 prior to January 1st of 2026. So the language that they provided in the fall was that by January 1st of 2026, the jurisdictions that want to use EPPP would need to make that change. But if individual states wanted to adopt it earlier, they could. But to this point, the board has not made any recommendations about adopting that prior to January 1st of 2026.
Very good, thank you.
Understood, right? So states will have to have something for doctoral you can't just do the part one. If you're doing part one, you have to do part two also after the date. Got it.
Right. For the licensed psychology profession, if you're going to use the EPPP after January 1st of 2026, you will need to have the first part and the second part as a requirement. But for
You
master's
can't
level,
just do the second part as a workaround. You do both. Okay,
correct.
I like that.
That's how it's been described. But
Okay.
for master's level programs that master's level, jurisdictions that have a master's level license, they've noted that there may be and likely will be some issues with that in terms of applying that to those programs too. So they're working on that. And they said that's to be determined how they're going to provide a solution for that. There's also conversation about if they would be looking, if there would be any kind of requirement from ASPPB to have individuals go back who had already become licensed by passing the EPPP, the first part. Would there be any kind of look to see, okay, now you have to go back and pass EPPP too? And they said it's not their intention to go back and require that as a new item that people would have to pass. And so, but it potentially could affect reciprocity, I suppose, in certain jurisdictions, because if there are jurisdictions that require both parts and they've already adopted that, if you pass the first part and then they require that as part of reciprocity, it could come into play there. But and kind of a few different layers to that conversation.
Anyone else have topics they'd like to discuss in the few minutes we have left? And then during our next meeting, Dave, will be the kind of board advisory committee training. Is that right?
I would recommend doing that at the August meeting, because if you want to review applicants at the next one,
Sure.
then you'll be making recommendations. Those could potentially be appointed by the chair of the board at the July meeting. And then those people, any new members their first meeting would be in August. And so that'd be a good time to do that training.
Great. All right. Anything else for the good of the cause? If not, thank you all. Dave, can we send out a doodle poll for possible dates in June?
Yes, I'll send a poll to the members of the committee and we can find a date to meet. And then once we've identified a date when most members can meet and we have quorum, then I'll go ahead and schedule that and send you a calendar invitation and also a note that's been scheduled.
Perfect. All right, then I'd accept a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, you can vote by signing off of Zoom. See you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.